E-scooters exploded onto the streets of American cities quite literally back in 2017. Their presence was so sudden and so chaotic that people made it a habit to throw them into nearby bodies of water. But today, these scooters are banned from cities around the world. Most companies have failed completely, and yet there are signs that there might be a resurgence on the horizon. A huge thank you to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. So on this channel, we've talked about a lot of trends that have caused a lot of drama, whether that be fake meat, Temu, or whatever water bottle happens to be popular at Target at the moment. But somehow, the e-scooters phenomenon has to be the craziest of all. When I say that these scooters somehow unleashed the absolute worst in people and completely disrupted the way that people get around cities, I am not exaggerating. Because the thing is, I think most people kind of forget that these things weren't just like an Elon Musk tech billionaire troll on the world, but were actually invented as a way to solve the mobility problem that we have in our cities. They became the face of what was already known in the transportation world as micro-mobility, which are basically bikes and scooters that are used for short trips within cities. This was something that urban planners had been talking about needing for years, and just for a second, if you ignore all of the stuff that you've heard about or know about these scooters, and you just listen to the idea on paper, it actually sounds kind of amazing. Because of the recent advancements in battery technology, these scooters offered a really cool and smart way for people to get around that previously never existed. They gave the rider more freedom than public transit would offer, but were easier to ride than a standard bicycle. They were easy to pick up, you could drop them off wherever you wanted, and at least at first, these things were really cheap. And to top it all off, if you've ever ridden one of these things, you know that they're actually kind of fun. Sketchy as hell, yes, but fun. And in those early days, it looked like these things were legitimately a game changer for our cities. Bird became the first electric scooter company to launch in Santa Monica, California, and within 1 year, they recorded 10 million rides, which is kind of incredible. However, as you probably know, that initial burst of enthusiasm didn't last long. Now, I have a potentially controversial hot take here, if you will. I think that the way that these scooters were released upon the public was actually kind of smart. Chaotic? Yes. Impactful? Also yes. Unless you lived in some of those first cities where these scooters were rolled out, you can't really understand just how jarring it was when these things were suddenly everywhere, overnight. This sort of guerrilla business tactic put the scooters and their company names on basically every news station across the country within days and forced cities to come up with new policies to figure out how to regulate them.
This one is crazy. Nearly 200 electric scooters taking over the streets. This happened in downtown LA this morning.
Lime has made a dump in Marina, leaving the streets full of their bright green electric scooters.
Was this an absolutely batshit crazy way to roll out an idea? Yes, absolutely. But I think that Bird and later Lime knew that if they had brought these scooters to city councils across the country, they would have been stuck in bureaucracy for years before a single scooter ever reached the streets. What this rollout did is that it made their intentions incredibly clear and allowed the idea to be tested in real time by the public, for better and for worse. These big tech companies had the money and the reckless disregard for the rules to make it happen. But listen, the move fast and break things motto of the tech industry is rarely a strategy that goes smoothly, hence the second part of it there. Because this isn't just an app on your phone. These are real scooters in the real world with real people, and I honestly don't think that they were prepared for what would happen next. These scooters were being ridden on major highways, in bike lanes, on sidewalks, and in public parks, and nobody wanted them anywhere. And when the scooters themselves weren't getting mangled, the people on them were. These scooters can go up to 15 miles per hour, which, if you've ever ridden one of these things, is way too fast to be going on a scooter. Then on top of this, at a technical level, these things are also a nightmare. Scooters needed to be charged, they needed to be redistributed when they started piling up in one spot, and they needed to be tougher to withstand the life of living on the streets. People treated them like garbage. It honestly seems like there's like a challenge out there in the world for people who want to use these things in a bunch of crazy ways. And as the scooters started rolling out in more cities, there was increased pressure from residents to regulate these things in some way. And over the following years, these companies were forced to add regulatory tools to make these scooters less of a nuisance to the people who lived in the city. Speed limiting technology, drop-off zones, and helmets, but we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. First, I want to talk about how this boom and bust happened. So peak scooter insanity was in 2019, and then COVID really took the wind out of the sails. Because if people weren't going to be leaving their houses to go visit their families, they weren't going to be sharing random scooters with strangers on the street. Big players like Bird and Lime laid off staff during this time, and since then, these scooters really haven't been in the headlines as much. And honestly, people have kind of forgotten about them. Other than that one time when Bird filed for bankruptcy. And it seemed like that was kind of it. Like maybe that was the end of the story. And then just recently, we saw this headline. That's right, in 2023, Lime posted their first profitable year ever. And chances are, if you learned about this scooter trend, it was through some sort of news media outlet, and probably one that aligns with your political ideology. That's why we're stoked to be sponsored by Ground News. They're an app and a website that allows you to keep up with all the latest things that are going on in your favorite categories, all in one place. We keep working with Ground News because we genuinely love their service, and we think that you probably will too, so feel free to check them out at ground.news/futureproof or just scan this QR code. If it's tech that is interesting to you, they've got you covered with over 5,000 stories in just the last 3 months on the subject. Each of these stories features multiple articles from all ends of the political spectrum, and you can also tell who they're backed by and what their level of factuality is. One truly amazing feature is their blind spot feed, which shows you what the left and the right are and are not focusing on. Here, you can get easy access to the other side's news reality to see the full picture of what's going on in the world. It also means that you won't miss anything if you gravitate to one side of the spectrum or the other, or if you rely on social media for your information. We love Ground News because they encourage making informed decisions by sharpening your critical thinking skills, just like we do here on this channel. So I encourage you to dive right in by going to ground.news/futureproof or just scan this QR code to get started. You can join for less than $1 a month or use our link in the description to get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan, which is what we use here on the channel. A huge thank you to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back into the chaos. Now, while the dramatic transportation takeover might not have gone the way that they imagined, there still might be a future for these scooters. See, even with all of the carnage and dysfunction of this rollout, the hundreds of millions of rides that people took in those early years of this phenomenon shows that people are interested in and truly need other transportation options to get around our cities. This sudden influx of alternative transportation modes revealed in pretty stark contrast how completely car-dependent our cities are, and that other options would be pretty successful if they were done correctly. What ended up happening is that each city either tried to find a way to regulate the e-scooters, and their companies either had to follow suit or leave, with a lot of cities forbidding more than 2 or 3 micromobility companies from operating at the same time, just to keep the number of scooters on the streets to a minimum. We see cities like Spokane, Washington, allowing Lime back, but with stricter regulations to hold their business accountable. Edmonton, Alberta has recently signed a longer-term contract with both Lime and Bird, which is still going strong in Canada, so that they can operate 24/7 as long as the weather allows for it. But the tech bros also had to get a little smarter with how these scooters worked. Lime has redesigned their own vehicles to have swappable batteries so that they're easier to charge and maintain as a fleet. Bird has downsized their operations and pulled out of all but their most lucrative markets. And probably most importantly and most predictably, they've gotten a lot more expensive. These price increases took a lot of people by surprise. In the early days of Lime, these scooters were really affordable. Think like 15 cents per minute, but they've been steadily jacking those up over time. I took a ride on a scooter when I was in Washington, D.C., and my 25-minute ride cost me $10.98, which is about 43 cents per minute. And I would say that that's probably closer to average. Now, you could debate whether or not that's actually a decent price for a little trip across town, but what you might notice in that video is that we're not wearing helmets. And that's actually a much bigger problem than you might think for these scooter companies. As a lot of these municipalities learn that these scooters are like super dangerous, they've started pushing for more helmets as a way to control their expansion. But the truth is, nobody's wearing them. And this is a really tricky thing for Lime and Bird because there have been countless recorded injuries associated with these things and even some fatalities. So they had to do something. And what they did was really cringy. Both Lime and Bird pumped out some pretty standard PR firm style programs to get people to ride with one of their helmets on, which felt like some sort of mandatory employee training from like a Walgreens or something. And then when that inevitably didn't work, they just sponsored a bill to make it legal for people to ride without a helmet instead. So it seems like for the next little while, e-scooters aren't going anywhere. And interestingly, we're starting to see what this industry could actually look like long term. One stat that I found really fascinating is that 60% of Lime's money comes from their cities around the world where the infrastructure is not so focused on owning a car to get around. Think Rome, Sydney, London, Milan, and even Paris. Basically, places that have bike lanes. The irony here is that city planners have been advocating for pedestrian and cycling infrastructure for like years, but it took a tech startup's forced takeover of our public spaces to get these issues into the news. Now, cities around the world see the demand for micromobility, and in many cases, they still can't afford to build it themselves. So they're looking for ways to adapt and integrate this mode of transportation into their city through these companies. Basically, they're looking for a truce. Many of the cities where the collaborations have gone the best are where there is a natural combination of infrastructure for bikes and other pedestrians already built by the city, and with certain limitations on the range and the use of the scooters that are being brought in. One of the biggest changes is the designated drop-off zones and docking stations for bikes and scooters. Because honestly, it was fun, right? When we had these things scattered all over the place, you could pick one up, rip across town, huck it out front of the store that you showed up at, and just totally forget about it. But while it was cool, it was ultimately not very realistic. Our cities are way too busy to have scooters and bikes just thrown all over the place. And so these more integrated programs are starting to pop up. Grand Rapids, Michigan teamed up with Lime to create a Lime Access program, which gives 50% off to each rider based on their needs and even gives free 30-minute rides a day to all eligible residents. And some places that had previously banned scooters are letting them back in again. Probably the fullest manifestation of this is actually in Vancouver, here in Canada. Here, the city is teaming up with Lime to integrate its services into the existing public transit infrastructure. Under this particular agreement, Lime would pay the city something called system fees to pay for the use of public right-of-way, program administration, engineering, technical reviews, and compliance enforcement. This allows for these scooters to actually be a functional and practical part of our city fabric. And what's frustrating is that we kind of already had this. The city bikes that are famous around New York have been around since 2013. These bikes are not dockless, but they are better integrated with city infrastructure, with bikes near buses and transit hubs. And the whole program is offset through corporate sponsorship, City Bike being named after the program sponsor, Citibank. This allows the program to have cheaper prices too, which would have been less than half of what I paid for my Lime scooter rental. Taking this to a whole other level, the Dutch have had a bike system that's fully integrated with its transit pass for years. It's called the OV Fiets, Fiets being bike in Dutch. They live in Holland. The country's called the Netherlands. They are Dutch and they speak Dutch. Even as a Dutch person, I still find that incredibly complicated. OV Fiets means public transportation bike, and that's because it's a completely government-run program, which makes it pretty different from the other examples, but it shows how micromobility can be done at this scale. They're completely integrated. You use the same card for the train that you do for your bike, and they're insanely affordable at less than €5 for 24 hours of use. So we don't necessarily know how things are going to roll out with Lime going into the future, but I want to be optimistic because we've already got some examples of how it can be done well, And, you know, if we don't let these corporate scooter overlords create a terrible monopoly, maybe this service cannot suck for everybody who wants to enjoy it. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you got something out of it, remember to like it and subscribe if you want to see more content from us every single week.